At my daughter's medical school graduation, she stood at the podium in front of 300 people and said the worst thing anyone has ever said to me. My mother spent 32 years emptying bedpans and changing IV bags, so I guess this is what real ambition looks like, actually using the brain God gave you. The auditorium laughed. Not all of them, but enough. My ex-husband, sitting 2 rows ahead with his new wife, turned around and gave me this small sympathetic shrug. Like, what can you do, Mara? She's just being honest. And then the dean of medicine walked up to the microphone, leaned in, and said into the silence that followed her speech, "Before we conclude, I'd like to acknowledge the woman who quietly built the wing your daughter will be doing her residency in. Would Mara please stand?" My daughter's smile died on her face mid-sentence. Let me back up. I drove to that ceremony in a 2014 Subaru Outback with 180,000 miles on it and a coffee stain on the passenger seat that I'd given up trying to clean 3 years ago. I parked between a Tesla and a Lexus that still had the dealership plates on it. The Tesla belonged to my daughter's roommate's father. I recognized the vanity plate from a photo she posted on Instagram at Christmas. The one I wasn't tagged in. I sat in my car for a full 4 minutes before I got out, doing the thing I always do, which is breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6, like the chaplain at Mercy General taught me to do when families lose someone unexpectedly. I needed it that morning. I really did. I'd worn a navy blue dress from Macy's that I'd bought on clearance the week before. $212 marked down to $68, and I still felt guilty paying that much. Old habits. I had a small wrapped box in my purse, a stethoscope I'd had engraved with her initials and the date, the same brand I'd carried for the last 15 years of my career. I'd told myself she'd appreciate the symbolism, that maybe it would mean something to her, the way some things get passed down. I knew, even as I wrapped it, that she probably wouldn't. But I'd done it anyway. The auditorium at Westbrook University smelled like the cologne of 2,000 people trying too hard. I found a seat in the 3rd row, on the aisle, where I could see her cross the stage, but wouldn't be in any of the family photos. That was a habit too. I'd learned over the years that being too visible in my daughter's life cost her a kind of low-grade embarrassment she could never quite name. So I'd gotten good at being a presence that didn't quite take up space. The mother who showed up but somehow never made it into the frame, my ex-husband Greg, was already there. He'd flown in from Phoenix with his wife Lindsay, a woman 15 years younger than me, who taught Pilates to women 15 years younger than her. They both waved when they saw me, and I waved back, and that was the extent of the interaction we'd be having that day, which suited everyone fine. Greg had remarried 2 years after our divorce. I had not remarried. I had not, as a matter of fact, gone on more than 4 dates in the 11 years since the papers were signed. People assumed that meant I was bitter, but it didn't. It just meant I'd been busy. The graduates filed into that processional music every medical school in America uses, and my daughter Whitney walked in 5th from the front. She'd always wanted to be near the front. Even in kindergarten, she'd push to the front of the line for snack time. And the teachers would let her, because she was the kind of child who somehow made you feel grateful when she allowed you to give her what she wanted. She was beautiful. I have to say that, even from the 3rd row, with her hair pinned up under that velvet cap, she looked like the kind of woman who walks into rooms and changes the temperature. I was proud of her. I want to be clear about that, whatever came later, whatever I did. I want to be clear that when I watched her walk down that aisle in her crimson hood, I felt the same thing I'd felt the day they put her in my arms at St. Catherine's Hospital in Sacramento. That's mine. That's my whole heart, walking around outside my body. I'd like to tell you that what came next surprised me. It didn't. Whitney had been chosen to give the student response speech. I knew this. She'd told me about it 3 weeks earlier on a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. "Don't sit too close, Mom," she'd said. "I get nervous when I can see you in the audience." I'd said okay. I'd said congratulations. I'd asked if she wanted me to take her out for dinner after, and she'd said she had plans with Greg and Lindsay and her boyfriend's family at a place called Belmonte's, and that she'd send me pictures. She didn't invite me. I want to be specific about that because for years I'd softened these moments in my own retelling, made them gentler than they were. She didn't invite me. She told me where she'd be eating without me, and she expected me to thank her for the information. So when she stepped up to the podium in her ceremonial robe, and she adjusted the microphone, and she scanned the crowd with that confident smile she'd perfected somewhere between her sophomore year and her interviews for residency, I knew. I'd known since the phone call. I'd known honestly for years. She thanked her professors. She thanked her cohort. She made a joke about Cadaver Lab that got a big laugh. And then her eyes found me in the third row and held there for one beat too long, and she said, "I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the woman who showed me every single day what I did not want my life to look like." I felt the air leave my chest. "My mother," she said, and her voice was warm, almost tender. Which was worse, spent 32 years emptying bedpans and changing IV bags. So I guess this is what real ambition looks like? Actually using the brain God gave you. There was a half-second of silence, the kind you get in operating rooms right before someone codes. And then a few people laughed. Uncertain laughter, the kind people use when they don't know if a joke is a joke. And then more people laughed, because that's how laughter works in a crowd. It catches like a flu. Greg turned around and gave me the shrug. Lindsay made a face that I think was meant to be sympathetic but landed somewhere closer to yikes. The woman next to me, a stranger in a cream-colored suit, leaned over and whispered, "I'm so sorry." "That was awful," I said. "Thank you." I said, "It's all right." I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the way I'd sat through 3 decades of being told my career was something to apologize for, and I waited. Whitney finished her speech. She got a standing ovation. She walked back to her seat, and as she sat down, she looked at me again, and there was something like triumph in her eyes. The same look she'd had at 12 when she'd shown me her first All-A report card with her father's name written in the parent-teacher slot. Even though I was the one who'd helped her with her science fair project for 6 weekends straight. The Dean of Medicine, Dr. Thermi, Marlon Ashby, returned to the podium. He was a tall man, 62, with the kind of weathered face that came from 20 years of giving bad news to families. He'd been a friend of mine for the better part of a decade, though Whitney didn't know that, and neither did Greg. He cleared his throat. He looked, very briefly, in my direction. And then he said, "Before we conclude this morning's ceremony, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge an extraordinary member of our community who has, until today, asked to remain entirely anonymous." The room shifted. You could feel it, 300 people pivoting their attention. 6 years ago, Dr. Ashby said, Westbrook University Medical School and its affiliated teaching hospital, St. Bartholomew's, were operating at a deficit of nearly $14 million. We had lost 3 department chairs to better-funded institutions. Our cardiac wing was scheduled for closure. A private donor working through a foundation made the decision to invest not just money, but time, expertise, and personal attention into rebuilding what we had nearly lost. I watched Whitney's face. She was still glowing from her ovation. She was looking at the dean with mild, polite curiosity, the way you'd look at a man giving a weather report. "The Linnea Hayes Foundation," he continued, "named after the donor's late mother, who died in our emergency department in 2017 from a complication that could have been prevented with proper staffing. A tragedy that became, for the donor, a calling, has contributed $16,400,000 to this institution over the past 6 years. The murmur that rippled through the auditorium was something I will remember as long as I live. This donor personally supervised the redesign of our cardiac care unit, which is now ranked 7th in the Pacific Northwest. She personally interviewed every nurse hired into our trauma division. She funded the full scholarships of 43 students, including, as a matter of public record, 14 members of today's graduating class. Whitney's expression had begun to change. Slowly. Like a sunset. Today, for the first time, she has agreed to be publicly recognized. Many of you know her already. Some of you have worked alongside her without ever realizing who she truly was. I'd like to ask Mara Hollenbeck, the founder and chief director of the Linnea Hayes Foundation, to please stand. I stood. I want to tell you what that felt like, but I'm not sure I can do it justice. I'd imagined this moment for 6 years. I'd rehearsed it, in some small private place inside myself. The way a child rehearses what they'd say if their teacher called on them. But the actual moment was nothing like the rehearsal. The actual moment was quiet. The actual moment was my knees feeling like wet paper and my hands trembling against the back of the chair in front of me, and Greg's mouth opening into a small surprised O that I'd never seen on his face in 23 years of marriage, and Whitney's diploma slipping from her hand and landing on the floor of the stage, and the small dry sound of it hitting the wood being the only thing I could hear over the rushing in my ears. The applause started slowly. It built. People stood. The woman in the cream suit beside me clapped so hard her bracelet snapped. Dr. Ashby smiled at me from the podium with the small private smile of someone who has been waiting a very long time to do something kind for a friend. And I just stood there. I didn't bow. I didn't wave. I just stood there until the applause died down, and then I sat back in my seat, and I folded my hands in my lap again, and I waited for my daughter to look at me. She did, eventually. The look on her face is the only thing in this story I'm not going to describe in detail, because it's the only thing I'm not sure I forgive myself for enjoying. The reception was held in the hospital's atrium. I'd designed that atrium. I'd argued for 2 months with the architect about the natural lighting, because nurses on 12-hour shifts need to remember what daylight feels like. I walked in, and I saw the brass plaque by the entrance. In memory of Linnea Hayes, 1944-2017, and I touched it, the way I always did, with 2 fingers, the way you touch the corner of a photograph you keep in your wallet. My mother had been a nurse. Did I mention that? She was a nurse for 41 years. She worked the labor and delivery floor at Mercy General in Sacramento, and she was the woman who delivered, by my last count, somewhere around 2,000 babies into the world with her own 2 hands. When I was a child, she would come home from 12-hour shifts and she would still have the energy to braid my hair, to read me 1 chapter of Charlotte's Web, to make me laugh until my stomach hurt. She used to tell me that nursing was the only profession where you got paid to love strangers. She used to tell me that the world was held up, mostly, by women who did invisible work and never asked to be seen. When she died, in an emergency room, in a city she'd given her whole life to, of a sepsis that should have been caught hours earlier by a staff that was understaffed by 60%. I was holding her hand. The doctor on call was a 31-year-old resident who hadn't slept in 19 hours and who, I would later find out, had asked 4 separate times for additional support and been denied. He cried when he told me. He was a good kid. He kept saying, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hollenbeck. I'm so sorry." And I kept saying, "It's not your fault, sweetheart. It's not your fault." It wasn't his fault, but it was someone's fault. And I had spent the next 6 years figuring out exactly whose and what to do about it. The lawsuit had taken 18 months. It settled for an amount that I had agreed not to disclose, but which, when added to my mother's life insurance, my father's pension that had transferred to her after his death, and the modest inheritance she'd left me from the sale of their home in Roseville, came to a number that surprised even me. I'd never been a person who knew how to spend money. I'd raised Whitney on a nurse's salary and an alimony check that Greg had managed to negotiate down to almost nothing during the divorce. I drove old cars. I packed my own lunches. I hadn't taken a real vacation since 2009. So when I sat down with a financial advisor named Ramona Pickett, a woman my age, divorced, brilliant, and she asked me what I wanted to do with this money, I said the only thing I'd been thinking about for 6 months. I want to fix the place that killed my mother. Ramona didn't laugh. That's why I picked her, she said. Tell me what you mean. So I told her. I told her about the staffing ratios. I told her about the burnout. I told her about the way administrators in every hospital I'd worked in had treated nurses like a line item to be minimized, and how every preventable death I'd ever seen had been preventable because somewhere upstream, someone had decided that human bodies could be stretched thinner than they actually could. I told her I didn't want to give the money to a hospital. I wanted to be the hospital. Or at least the part of it that mattered. She helped me set up the foundation. Linnea Hayes, my mother's full maiden name, which Whitney had never bothered to learn because Whitney had only met her grandmother twice before she died. We approached Westbrook because they were drowning, and drowning institutions are willing to take meetings with people in inexpensive shoes. I sat across from Dr. Ashby in his office in October of 2019, and I told him what I had and what I wanted. I expected him to be skeptical. I expected him to talk down to me. He didn't. He listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, and then he said, "Mrs. Hollenbeck, can I be candid with you? I've been waiting for someone like you to walk into this office for 15 years. We started with the cardiac wing, then the trauma division, then the scholarship program, because nursing schools were emptying out across the country, and I knew in my bones that the only way to fix the staffing crisis was to make it possible for a smart kid from a working-class family to become a nurse without taking on $100,000 in debt. I funded 43 of those kids. 2 of them sent me letters every Christmas, and I tucked those letters into a wooden box in my closet, the only personal thing I'd ever framed in my life. And yes, I funded my daughter. This is the part I have to tell you carefully. Whitney did not need the money. Greg paid her tuition. Greg, who had become a successful commercial real estate broker in Phoenix, paid for her undergraduate education at Pomona, paid for her MCAT prep, paid for her medical school, but the housing stipend Westbrook offered to medical students from underrepresented backgrounds, a stipend that, by a complicated formula, included students whose parents had divorced and whose lower-earning parent was a hospital nurse, that stipend came directly from the Linnea Hayes Foundation. Whitney had received $14,000 a year for 4 years, $56,000. She had no idea where that money came from. She had complained to me, exactly once, that the application process was humiliating because it required her to disclose my income. I had never told her, not because I was waiting to humiliate her. I want to be very clear about that, because some of you, I think, are imagining a colder woman than the one I am. I never told her because telling her would have changed something between us that I wasn't ready to lose. I was still her mother. I was still hoping she'd come around. I was still, on every birthday and every Mother's Day, and every holiday that passed without a phone call, hoping she'd remember that I was the one who'd held her in St. Maud, Catherine's hospital, who'd nursed her through the croup at 3 weeks old, who'd sat outside her bedroom door the night she'd come home drunk at 17 and cried because Greg had already moved out and I didn't know how to do any of this alone. I kept the secret because I loved her. I want that to be on the record. But that morning, in that auditorium, when she said what she said about bedpans and IV bags, when she stood in a robe I had partially paid for, on a stage that existed because of money I had given to the institution that trained her, and she made my life into a punchline for a room full of strangers, something inside me, something that had been bending for 30 years, finally broke clean. I'd called Dr. Ashby the night before the ceremony. I knew Whitney was giving the speech. I knew her well enough to suspect what was coming. He'd asked me what I wanted to do, and I told him I wasn't sure. He said, "Mara, I have been asking you for 2 years to let us recognize you publicly. The board has been asking. The donor relations office has been asking. If you ever want to make a different decision about that, I want you to know that I can have a script ready by morning. I'd slept on it. I'd woken up at 4, made coffee, and called him at 6. Have the script ready, I said. That was all. The reception in the atrium went the way these things go when something has just happened that no one knows how to talk about. Greg approached me first. He'd left Lindsay by the punch bowl. His face had a strange grayish quality I hadn't seen on him since the day his father died. Mara, he said. I didn't know about any of this. No, I said. You didn't. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at him for a long moment. The man I'd loved at 22, who'd told me at 38 that I'd let myself become boring and that he needed more from a partner than dedication and overtime. I looked at him, and I felt something I genuinely had not expected to feel, which was nothing, just the quiet absence of a feeling I'd carried for a long time. Because it wasn't for you, I said, and I walked away. Whitney didn't approach me at the reception. She stood near a table of cheese cubes with her boyfriend's family. A perfectly nice family from Connecticut, the boyfriend a third-year cardiology fellow, his mother a real estate attorney, and I could see her trying to perform normalcy, trying to laugh at things, trying to act like the speech she'd given an hour ago hadn't just been publicly disassembled by the most powerful man in the building. She kept glancing at me. I kept not looking at her. After about 40 minutes, I said my goodbyes to Dr. Ashby, who hugged me, and to Mrs. Bay, Yamashita from the donor relations office, who cried a little. And I walked out to my Subaru and I sat in the driver's seat, and I did the breathing again. 4 counts in. 6 counts out. She called me that night. Not from her own phone, from Greg's. She knew I would have answered Greg's number and not hers. Mom, she said. Hi, Whitney. Mom, can we talk? I didn't say anything. I didn't know, she said. I had no idea. The dean. What he said, I didn't. Whitney. Yes? You did know, I said, quietly. You always knew. You just didn't know the exact dollar amounts. You knew your mother had spent her life caring for sick people. You knew I worked 12-hour shifts so you could go to a private high school and learn fencing. You knew it. You just decided, somewhere along the way, that the work I did was something you could mock in front of 300 people. The amounts of money are a separate matter. She was quiet. Then she started to cry. Not the crying she used to do when she wanted something from me when she was 9. This was different. This had air in it. This had a kind of breaking I'd never heard from her before. I want to make this right, she said. I know you do, I said. And I want you to. I told her what I'd already told the dean and the residency director earlier that afternoon. The Limia Hayes Foundation would continue to fund her residency at St. Bartholomew's because pulling that funding would only punish a hospital that didn't deserve to be punished, but the foundation would no longer be making any contributions of any kind toward Whitney's living expenses, her board exam fees, her continuing education credits, or any other support of any kind. She would be a doctor under the supervision of attending physicians, half of whom I'd personally helped recruit, and most of whom had eaten dinner in my kitchen at some point in the last 4 years. She would be observed, she would be evaluated, and she would, over the course of her 3-year residency, work alongside nurses, the women I had spent my career fighting for, the women I had hired into that hospital, the women who would now be, every single day of her training, the people whose competence and judgment her own career would depend on. You're going to learn what your mother actually does for a living, I told her. You're going to learn it from the women who do it, and if at the end of 3 years you still believe what you said today, then you and I will have a different conversation. But for now, that's what I need from you. That's fair, she said. And then she said very quietly, I'm sorry, Mom. It wasn't enough. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't nearly enough, and I didn't pretend that it was. But it was a beginning, which was more than I'd had at 4 o'clock that morning when I'd called Dr. Ashby and told him to print the script. I'd like to tell you that everything got better after that my daughter and I rebuilt our relationship, that we became close, that the breach was healed. The truth is more complicated. The truth is that healing, real healing, takes longer than a movie has time for, and what we've built since that day is something more careful than what we had before, and probably more honest. She calls me on Sundays now. She asks about my work. She listens. Last spring, after a 40-hour shift in the trauma bay, she called me crying about a patient she'd lost, a 63-year-old woman whose family she'd had to tell. And she said, "Mom, I don't know how you did this for 32 years. And I said, "I did it because somebody had to. Sweetheart, that's all. Somebody had to." I drove home that night from her graduation, the engraved stethoscope still in my purse, unopened, and I stopped at a diner off the freeway because I didn't feel like cooking, and I ordered a grilled cheese and a coffee, and the woman behind the counter, a woman about my age, with her hair in a tired bun, refilled my cup 3 times without me asking. I left her a $40 tip on a $14 check. She caught me at the door as I was leaving. "Ma'am," she said, "this is too much. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "Why?" she asked. I thought about it. I thought about my mother's hands, and the chapel at Mercy General, and the brass plaque in the atrium I'd designed, and the look on my daughter's face when her diploma hit the stage. I thought about everything that had broken and everything I'd built and everything I would eventually learn how to forgive. "Because I see you," I told her. "That's all. I see you." And I walked out into the parking lot, and I got into my old Subaru, and I drove home. I've thought a lot, in the years since that morning at Westbrook, about how we got there. How a child I'd carried in my body for 9 months and raised on 12-hour shifts and grilled cheese sandwiches grew into a woman who could stand at a podium and turn my life into a joke. I don't think she became cruel by accident. I think she learned, somewhere along the way, that the people who do quiet work are easy to step on, and the world rewarded her for thinking that. Every shrug from her father, every glossy magazine that celebrated titles over labor, every moment she watched me come home exhausted and assumed exhaustion was something to be avoided rather than honored, those things added up. Cause and effect. We become what we are taught to admire and what we are taught to dismiss. But the same law that built her arrogance built my answer to it. Every shift I worked taught me something. Every patient I lost taught me what happens when systems fail people who can't fight back. Every dollar I saved, every plan I made with Ramona at her kitchen table, every meeting with Dr. Ashby. Those were 30 years of small, unglamorous decisions that no one was clapping for. And when the day came, those decisions held. They were the floor I stood on when my daughter tried to knock me down. I don't believe in karma the way some people use the word. I believe in something simpler. I believe that what you build in private is what you have when the public moment finally arrives. I believe that character is not something you announce. It is something you accumulate, quietly, in the hours when no one is watching. Whitney spent her 20s polishing her resume. I spent mine learning how to keep dying people alive at 3 in the morning. Both took intelligence. Only one took the kind of strength that doesn't ask to be seen. If I could say one thing to anyone listening, especially to younger women who feel small and unseen in their own families, it would be this. Do not let the people who underestimate you set the size of your life. Do not shrink to fit the room you were given. Use the years they think you are wasting. Read, save, plan, build. The world is full of women in old Subarus who own the buildings the loud people are bragging inside of. Be one of them. Not for revenge. Revenge is a small fire and it burns out fast. Build for yourself. Build because the work matters. Build because somewhere there is a 31-year-old resident who hasn't slept in 19 hours and a woman who needs him to have help. And that woman is somebody's mother. I'm still nursing. I still take shifts at St. Mother Bartholomew's twice a month, in scrubs, on the trauma floor. The new residents don't know who I am. They call me ma'am. They ask me to show them how to draw blood from a difficult vein. I show them. That, more than anything else, is the answer to what my daughter said about me that morning. The answer is that I'm still here. I'm still doing the work. And the work is still what holds the world up.